Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Marketing Corner.
Whoop, whoop, whoop.
Yeah, you did it. Great.
I did it this time.
Today we have a special guest
Yes.
in
Our youngest guest, possibly.
our youngest guest ever.
Mhm.
But this is just going to show, like, just going to prove we can make it work, right?
We make it work.
We make it work. So you're listening in, you might hear some baby sounds along the way,
Yeah.
but it's because Jen has her newborn here.
Yes, everyone. This is Loki, or as the
Yeah,
Danes would say, Loki.
yeah. And he happens to also be a pricing expert, which is
He is.
great because that's
Yeah.
what we're going to be talking about today. So Jen and I have been scrambling, and we actually participated both in Sassiest earlier this year. And there was one of the keynotes, Ulrich, who's a really cool guy, and we'll try to get him on the pod in the future. But he talked about pricing, and we actually looked at each other like, we haven't talked too much about pricing on the pod before,
Mhm.
and we really want to. So here we are. Episode 90 is going to be about pricing. So with that said, Jennifer, let's start with your role and what you're doing on Amondo. How much, maybe I'll open it a little bit wide. How much do you care about pricing? How much are you involved
Mm.
in the pricing discussions?
I'm not so much involved in the setting of the price, so much as do we put the price on our landing page or on our website or not? That's kind of where my involvement comes. Whereas finance, C-level, product usually sit with how much do we charge. I'm the one who's how transparent do we be about our pricing, which I think is a really interesting debate. And another reason we wanted to talk about this, right, is we were just live at Tech Barbecue and pricing came up of
Yeah.
how transparent do you be? And yeah, so I thought it would be an interesting conversation because I think you have one very specific point of view, and
Mm,
I don't know my point of view because I sit on both sides of the fence.
yeah.
But yeah, so in my role as VP of Growth, it's more how much do we tell about the pricing and what impact is that having on our ability to generate leads?
Exactly. And I think I'm pretty. I don't know if I'm, out there or extremist, but I'm very much for full transparency as much as you can. And so I always advocate for having pricing on your website, and I do understand and respect that there's some cases that are harder to do that. Yeah, if you're a Boston Consulting Group and a consultancy, it's a little bit hard to have pricing, right? Like, because they do so many different things. I get it. I totally get it. But don't. But fundamentally, there's so many cases where there's no real excuse, and I understand why people do it. But my point has always been that it's very rarely because of the customers. Like, it's not because the customers don't want to have pricing on the website. Quite
Exactly.
contrary.
Exactly, and I think that's where I sit on the fence because from a prospect's point of view, I want pricing. On a pricing page, I
Mm.
want to know exactly transparent pricing, like you said. I think that's super important. And as a consumer, I want to know what I'm going to be charged. As a vendor who has, at least in our product, we have a physical component. It's really hard for us to know how much is that physical component going to cost us. How much are you going to need different aspects of the product? How much are we going to have to tailor it to your needs, which makes it very difficult for us to pinpoint an exact cost. And that's kind of the double-edged sword that we have in B2B SaaS is how transparent do you be? Not because you want to lie to customers and charge them as much as you possibly can, but things can change in an instant. And I'll give you an example. Again, we have a physical component. So when the pandemic hit, we had a problem getting those physical components, which drove the price up. When the invasion of Ukraine happened, we had a similar situation where it was harder to get these physical components, which drives the price up. Do we absorb that cost and hurt our margins? Do we pass that on to the customer? And these are the questions that you have to ask yourself when these things come up, which can make it harder to be super concrete on pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important, like, whenever you're in this kind of discussion and today we're starting here with the pricing on your website kind of talk or not, right? And then we'll get into the details around the strategies after that. But here, let's just talk about the transparency of it. I think there's pros and cons, and I fully 100% recognize that. So as an example, like, the pro of having transparent pricing is that people can make more informed decisions. So the ones that come to you and actually do inbound, or you talk to them, well, they've already made up their mind if they can afford it or not. And that's how, like, for Sparkforce, we're an agency which is very unheard of to have pricing on your website. It's I think we, at least in Denmark, we almost started a wave around it. And there's a lot of big agencies like told me, hey, it can't be done. You can't do it when you grow. And like, we're still growing, and I love it. So, but I think the point is just to say that transparent pricing does help like keep the right people interested and the wrong people not interested.
Mhm.
So the people who can't afford you, as an example, well, like you don't actually get to talk to them because they're
Yeah.
like, oh, most of them, they like after we put our pricing on our website, we don't have a lot of people who come to us and say they can't afford us because
Yeah.
they already looked at our pricing like, we can afford this. Okay, then we can talk.
Yeah.
And so it sets the scene. And
It's almost like a self-qualifier, right? It's a
it's a
self-qualifier.
self-qualifier,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's amazing. I've been loving that part.
Mhm.
Where of course it is hard is also that, and I understand it from another perspective. So like a con of that is also to say that you, in our case, we have 3 pricing packages. Well, let's say you get someone who's massive, like enormous. Like let's say, I don't know, Deloitte came knocking and said, we wanna work with Sparkforce across globally or across everything. Well, honestly, that doesn't fit into our packages today, right?
Yeah.
And having that conversation, be like, okay, that doesn't fit in our packages. Hey, that goes beyond what we have. That's a different conversation, and that's harder to do. It's harder to do this, that outcome based, value based chat after they've seen an initial pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good example of, if Deloitte come knocking, it's the thing that you're doing is probably the thing that most teams wish that their C-level would do, of like, say no.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
There's if you have this huge organization come and your company can't handle it, sometimes it's hard for people to say no. They're like, could we? Could we do it?
Yeah, exactly.
I won't say the name of the company, but I've worked at a company before where a company that is way, way, way out of our scope came knocking, and it turned into the whole product roadmap, everything about customer success, everything about sales. Everyone was just focused on this one prospect because that would be a quarter of our revenue for the year. But in the end, you put all your eggs in that basket, and then that person churns, or that person doesn't, or that prospect doesn't come through. So it's a good way, again, of self-qualification of like, this is the box that we can cater to.
Yeah.
Either you're too small or too big. Thank you for your time. You want to get those good fit customers, and having a price on your pricing page is one way of making sure that you're going to attract the right type of customer.
Yeah,
And
and
set expectations.
I totally agree, right? But I think it's it makes it harder to do value based pricing when you have pricing on your website. That's just that's the rule I've learned.
Mhm.
But it also like, I just want to point out, like, I know this is maybe a trick, but it's also value based pricing. It's not at the benefit of the customer. Like, it's very
Yeah.
rarely that your prices go lower because of this. Quite contrary, it goes the other way, right?
Maybe before we go into that, let's cover what those are in case
Yeah.
people aren't sure what the different when we say value-based pricing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
essentially, you can kick us off, but the way also, like, there's 3 types of pricing, right? Like, or like, there's a lot of different ways, but there's like 3, let's call it, strategies within it. Do you want to cover the first one?
Yeah, sure. So this one is probably the most well-known, and that's cost plus pricing. So it costs us $100 to make something. So you add a markup of say 30% and charge people $130. So that's the cost plus. And the pros of that, obviously, it's super easy to cost. It's super easy to implement. But then the cons, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is it doesn't take into account demand, supply, control costs, and things like that. So you could end up eating into your margins, for example, if you have a chip shortage and you have to pay more for your chips, but you can't move out of that cost plus pricing.
Hmm. And typically, like, like you would say, like, it's better for products where like there's a stable cost. It's not really great for dynamic or highly competitive markets, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I agree.
exactly.
Yep.
All right. The other one is called market-based pricing.
Mhm.
So essentially, you base it on competitors' pricing and the market conditions. So you focus on competitive positioning, and you try to like focus on what's the demand of customers instead of actually what's the production cost.
Mhm.
What would you say are the pros of that one?
Yeah, so it helps you stay competitive.
Yeah.
So for example, say, one competitor's charging $50, so you charge 48, so you're a little bit less than the competition. So it helps you stay a little bit flexible. But then I would say that the cons are, if you're, going against someone else, again, you're going to eat into your margins. If you're always trying to undercut the competitors, you're going to have less and less profit in your pocket to play with.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's about the margins at the end, right? That's kind
Yeah,
of what's
exactly.
hurting, right? It's typically like it's typically best for like markets where there's a lot of competition. Like I don't know, like in if you think about like B2C, it's like retail,
Mm,
electronics, those kind of things, where it's where the when the products are not sticky.
mhm.
Like so when it's not sticky products, it's easy to substitute them, and there's a lot of dynamics in the market because of the market conditions. So fashion, travel, stuff like that,
Mhm.
typically.
Exactly.
All right.
And what about number 3? The one you were just talking about.
Yes, value-based pricing. Here, price is based on the perceived value, like right. So instead of the actual cost of production or the market, you focus on how much customers are actually willing to pay for something. So, and
Mhm.
depending on the value they get, its uniqueness and the problem it solves for them. Again, what would we say are pros and cons of that one?
Yeah, so the pros, obviously you can have much higher profit margins. It's
Yeah.
based on a perceived value than rather than what it costs you. And one of the examples we gave at Tech Barbecue, right, is the Rolex. A Rolex can cost around $5,000 to make, but you can sell them for $100,000 because they're a status symbol. So, the margins can be 100%, 400%. And it builds a sense of loyalty, right? Because you're associating it with the value of your brand, and it makes the focus on the value creation. But then
Mm.
again, the cons, it's really hard to get to that level, right? None of
Yeah.
us have ever really worked in a company that is the Rolex of SaaS. No
Yeah.
offense.
No,
No
no,
offense
no.
to our companies out there, but we have to be a little bit more competitive. We can't charge a 400% markup because of the brand we've created. So it takes a long time. It also is, I think it's very volatile again with market conditions.
Mm.
If we're in a recession, a lot of people are not probably going to be dropping that money on a Rolex. Some
No.
are, and that's great, but a majority won't. So it can be very subjective. It can be very volatile.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think it's also it's 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 um it's a different animal in SaaS, right? Like because SaaS is like B2B SaaS in general. It's not the same as comparing B2B SaaS to a Rolex. Like it's
Mhm,
just perception of value is very different. But I also think it's with that said, I think a lot of B2B SaaS and general B2Bs and stuff like that are trying to do this though. I
mhm,
mean, that's interesting. Like, because then it becomes like a lot of companies used to be able to like what they try to do. I think it's also like a positioning play. Like, if you think about it, what they tried to do was try to position their products as like features. Like, hey, we saw feature X, Y, Z. You can help do this. Where it's like a lot of them discovered, okay, it's more about outcomes, right?
mhm.
So more about the outcome. So like, hey, having HubSpot lets your whole organization sell more or
Right.
do better marketing, right? And that leads to more revenue, right?
Yeah, it's the
Okay,
efficiency gains and stuff like that, right? It's the
yeah,
other value.
it's the other value, and that's a
Yeah.
perceived value, right? Because like it's not necessarily super easy to track at least from day one. So it's
Mhm.
the perceived value of having something like that.
And
Um,
that's I know I talk about this all the time, but I think it's such an interesting article is the Harvard Business Review that showed people are willing to pay more for a convenient process. So if
mm,
you're going to have them do 6 discovery calls and you need to have an on-site meeting for implementation versus we could set you up within the next 24 hours over the phone, no problem, people will probably be that is also a value add, right? That is a perception of a value. Like, I would rather just have this done now. I'd rather pay more, have this done now, than pay less but have to jump through all these hoops. So I think in SaaS we have a way of creating other value, perceived value, whether
mm,
that is, like you said, this is going to help you generate more revenue. I know at Dixa we estimated that by using Dixa you can save on X amount of headcount. How
mm.
much do you pay those people? Well, then that equals this many savings in efficiencies and stuff like that. So if you can quantify it somehow, then that is how you can kind of show that value and justify perhaps a little higher cost because people are willing to pay for convenience and for the perceived value that could come down the road rather than what you're going to get right away.
Yes, absolutely. Also, I want to point something out that I find really interesting, and I want to get your take on this. So,
Mhm,
um, a lot of companies also find that they do because it's more for me it's value based pricing, but it's like outcome focused, right?
mhm,
Focused positioning. I actually consulted a company the other day, like 10-man company. They asked me for my advice on something, and they just rebranded, and I was like, and they had like a really fluffy statement, like a very outcome focused statement. I was like, guys, you're 10 people. Like, I don't like, it's great. I understand what you're trying to do and you're trying to be HubSpot, but you're not HubSpot. Like you're not
Yeah.
Salesforce. You're not these big companies. The reason these big companies can do that is that everybody knows who they are and what they do.
Mhm.
Like you don't come to HubSpot without having any idea what it is. That's
Right.
not what happens, right? So you come to HubSpot because you know, like it's CRM, it's marketing automation, and all these things, and then they can say like, "Hey, drive better results with HubSpot," or whatever it is their tagline is. You can't do that if you're 10-man startup because I was like, guys, I just talked to you, so I have a good idea of what you do. I don't actually. It's taking me a while to really understand what you do, and that's taking too long because that's some fluffy statement. So my point with saying that is, what's your take on that? Like, when do you transition into like more like a tagline on, and also goes back to the pricing that's more, I don't know, outcome focused. Let's call it that.
I guess it comes down to your position, right?
Mm,
I think it's okay to go up against some of the big guys, because the big guys always have flaws, and like Salesforce, it's impossible to figure out. So, you could say like Salesforce for dummies, and that would probably resonate to someone where it's like, oh, okay, I can do the same stuff as Salesforce without needing a PhD in Salesforce. So I think it's clever positioning, and I think it's good copywriting, as we've talked about in previous episodes. But if you're gonna be, sometimes we call it a Me Too product. Like there's one that exists. Oh, but we're here too.
yeah.
You're gonna be up against. And we had that at Dixa when we were going up against Zendesk.
Yeah.
Zendesk is a household name. I just had a moment where I forgot it, but that's
Not that
maternity leave.
household.
Not this household, because we're a Dixa family. God damn it. No, but we were going up against this, and instead of going like we're just like them, it was carving out our own outcomes based on
Mm,
what we know where they lacked, right? And I don't know if I'm not necessarily answering your question, but I don't think it's a bad thing to go after the big guys, and I don't think it's a bad thing to do the outcome. But you
no.
need to really boil it down in a way that is the USP. And how do you differentiate
Mm.
yourself from that household name, that category owner that you're also trying to carve out?
Exactly. And I think that comes back to the original point of why we're into this, is that your pricing is part of that. Like
Hmm.
for me, like if your pricing is like, if you're doing a markup type based pricing, like cost plus pricing, and you're trying to challenge the big dogs that are doing value based pricing, like you're competing on different fronts here. Like,
True.
and in who knows that there might be cases where it works, but like it's everything has to go together, right? Like if your
Mhm.
positioning is like, hey, we're a luxurious product, and you do cost plus pricing, like that doesn't fit, right?
Then you're not
Uh,
luxurious.
and
Luxurious.
no, you're not,
Yeah.
actually not. So I think that's important. I have a kind of like I don't know how to say like a term, like a thing I want to talk a little bit about when it comes to pricing. So now we talked a little bit about these pricing strategies. I want to talk a little bit about a concept, and I think it's just I think it's for the listeners. It might be a good thing to learn. It's something learned in economics. So, a term called price elasticity.
Mm.
Technically, it's called price elasticity of demand. Oh, fancy. Elasticity of demand. Oh. And it's a ratio that essentially shows how much demand for a product changes when the price of that product, the difference between milk and strawberries. It's a good example of saying like, um, milk is an inner milk is an price of milk doubled or tripled, you would still buy milk because you need milk, like
Mm.
for
Mhm.
whatever reason, right? Like so you need milk no matter what. You need milk for your coffee, or right. So there's not a lot of alternatives to milk. Whereas if you had strawberries, which is a luxury good, if they suddenly tripled in price, well, then you'd be like, okay, but maybe I'll buy just chocolate instead, or I'll buy a
Mhm.
banana instead. And I think now that's, don't get me wrong, that's a consumer good example I just used, but that's a very real thing in B2B SaaS, and like in the companies we kind of work with. As an example, I think Onomondo, let's say there's probably like there's not that many alternatives to Onomondo, right? Like
Of course not.
of course not. There's a few, but there's not that many, right? Like um so but there are some, and so it's not completely blue ocean, correct me if I'm wrong here. So you couldn't just raise your prices triple, because then they would be like, okay, what's the alternative, and then they'll go to
Mm.
that one instead, right?
I mean, ours is sticky because again, we're a physical component.
Mm,
So, if you put an Onomondo SIM card in 50,000 devices by hand, it's you're unlikely gonna want to bring all of it's you're unlikely gonna want to bring all of those devices from all over the world back to your headquarters and by hand change the SIM card. So, but also that's a shitty thing to do. And that's not how we want to do things. So, I guess you could say, yeah, we could, triple prices if we wanted, because what are you going to do? You're going to get all those devices back from Antarctica and change those SIM cards. But then that is going to feed into the brand, and people are going to be very unhappy. So I think it's the competition, but for a B2B SaaS, a traditional SaaS where it is software, pure software, I think it's a lot easier to just swap. And I know, again, I'm going to probably use Dixa a lot because that was a pure software product. That was one of the last pure software products I worked on, where we would even offer to run our product alongside the current one you have, so you can see a side-by-side comparison of how we're better. And and those kind of things that really helped us justify the cost and helped us kind of win those customers, and the kind of integrations that we had made that feasible. Whereas I think that maybe that's something for companies to think of like, how can you show your value to justify this extra cost? Because you could say to someone, hey, Casper, if you use this tool 100%, you are going to save 40% of your time. 40% of the time it works every time. But if you can't see it, if you can't do it, then how do you know that you can trust it and things like that? And that comes into maybe free trials and freemium models and things like that. But when it comes to pricing, there's different ways that you have to prove yourself. If you're not the household name, if you're not the Rolex of SaaS, you're not the Dream, the Salesforce, you are not the the HubSpot, you're going to have to do something different to justify that expense. And one of the things that always comes up, right, is don't be the cheapest, because people will see that and think, okay, you're probably missing a few of the core features that I really need, right? So you need to find that middle ground of being worth the money, but also not underselling yourself.
Yeah. And I think I love that. I love that response. I totally agree. I think there's a few things I want to mention before we end today, because we actually have a few minutes left. I just want to make sure we cover this part, because in SaaS, if you had to boil it down, so now what we essentially covered now is what's the overarching strategies that you think about when you go into pricing, and then this thing around price elasticity. But there's also some pure product pricing models, and especially when it comes to SaaS. And it's stuff like usage-based pricing, right? Like usage-based, so you would charge per user. There's the classic, the tiered pricing, which we're going to cover in a second. So different tiers, and you move up a tier, right? And then there's the classic flat rate pricing. So you have like usage of feature, and then you use a flat rate, you fixed fee for a software essentially. And then you have the freemium, which is not something we've covered today, but it's also part of this whole pricing discussion. Like, when do you have a freemium version, right? I know you guys have tried some free trials and stuff. And then lastly, you have per user pricing. So so essentially when you have it more per teams base, so it's not usage based per se, it's more per user. So those are the classic 5 ones. Have you used any of those before in the companies you work for?
Yeah, most of the companies, Planday and Dixa, were price per user.
Yes.
So exactly. in that helps, because it's like, as you grow, we grow. And so that a lot of SaaS companies do that, right? The subscription model per user.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different variations of it. I've used tiered pricing quite a bit. So it's you have different layers. So every time you upgrade a tier, you get access to new features, functionality. And it also goes for service levels, because what we have in SparkForce is technically what we call tiered pricing. Because when you upgrade a tier, you get access to some other service levels that you don't get to in another tier. And we don't have a lot of time to cover all of these, but I think it's just, when you go in that deep, first you define your overarching pricing strategy, and then you can pick between these 5 versions of how you price your SaaS essentially.
And I think before we end this episode, one of the key kind of themes that we had when we were at Tech Barbecue was that the pricing is not a one team initiative. It's not the marketing team that decided. It's not the sales team that decided. It's not even purely C-level. I think C-level have to steer the strategy, but you really need to roll in your finance team. How much can we afford to tag onto the top of this, without impacting our margins? How much elasticity will we have? How much wiggle room do we have in the pricing? Product, what do you need from us? CS, how much does it cost for you to onboard people? You really need to talk to everyone, and don't forget to look into the CAC, the customer acquisition costs. How much does it cost to get these customers on board? How much can you know, put in a little bit of a profit to reduce the CAC payback and things like that? So I think there's a lot of, it's not an easy thing to do, pricing. And I think that's another reason why most companies go away from a cost plus, because it's not easy to go, yep, $130, no problem. This is what our price is going to be forever, because it doesn't work that way in a lot of cases. So making sure that you involve your CS team, but at the same time, you can't have like a pure finance. Sorry, I said CS team, I meant finance team. But if it's a pure finance play, maybe they're going to have a 300% markup, and so there also has to be some understanding of the ICP. What are they willing to pay? As coming back to the beginning of what are people willing to pay? How much are other people charging? Really understanding the landscape, but also at the same time understanding your margins and how much buffer you can afford to lose in order to win that customer.
I totally agree.
We'll never solve whether you should have a price on a pricing page. I don't think I think that's one of those debates that we'll never
but I think there's some, like, you gotta have, from my opinion, you gotta have some real good reasons not to have pricing on your page. That's my kind of stance on all this. And I've just, every time I've put pricing for companies where I worked, every time we've done it, it's always been a good decision. So I'm very solidly in that camp, and I think I need to have a few cases where I'm proven otherwise before I ever change my stance. But
yeah, I mean, we ran an experiment at Onomondo about putting a price on our pricing page, and our conversions plummeted. And the reason that happened is because we did not do a good enough job of explaining the value, because we're not the cheapest on the market by any means, but we did not show why we're not the cheapest on the market in a very good way. So at least, we always say there's no such thing as a bad experiment. It's good to make mistakes, fail fast, learn fast, right? So we learned how we can make that better. And then we introduced these different packages, so we have kind of small business, medium-sized business, enterprise, and then we have these extra feature add-ons that you can, sort of as your business grows, you can add these different things on. But when you just whack a price on a pricing page with no context, without doing a really good job at showing the value, that's going to hurt your business.
Exactly. All right. We're coming to a close. So just to sum up for some people here, we talked a little bit today about like the different variations of like pricing overall strategy. So cost plus pricing, value-based pricing, and now I forgot, market condition pricing, essentially. So those are the three overarching strategies. Within that, there's then 5 different SaaS strategies, like usage-based, per user-based. There's tiered pricing. Now I'm forgetting all the other ones. That's my bad. Flat rate, that was the one. Yeah, sorry. Flat rate and freemium. And those are like the 5 SaaS kind of tiers. So once you've decided on a strategy, you can decide those. And then we talked a lot about like having prices on your website, right? And I think there will always be pros and cons, but I think the important part is just you involve your whole team and everyone in the discussion.
Leadership, executive team, product team, finance, CS, everyone has to be involved in this decision to make sure that you hit the sweet spot. And I'm sorry, I know I keep going on and on when we keep saying this is the end, but also remember, you're not getting your price tattooed on your forehead, right? Like you can revisit your pricing model, you can adjust your pricing model, but you need to start somewhere.
We've changed our pricing every year, and we're changing it again in January, and we're changing it constantly. Not constantly is too much, but like every 6 months or something, and we revisit it, like just to make sure it's up to date and it works the way we want it to work.
Yeah. So don't be afraid to I think sometimes people get too scared to start thinking how permanent this is. So it's not permanent, but you got to start somewhere.
And I know we're out of time, but I just want to say one thing. It used to be like there's this like classic, the 4 Ps of marketing, like product, price, promotion, and like product, price, promotion, placement.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's been, marketing has for a long time been relegated to only be promotion, but technically marketing should be like a big owning pricing, and pricing is such a big leverage, like in marketing in general. Like you can use it to so many things, like leverage. Hey, we're increasing our pricing. Come buy now, right? That's a marketing hack, essentially, right? So on that note, we'll call it for today. But thanks for tuning in, guys, and adjust your prices.
And let us know what you think about pricing on a pricing page. Let us know.
Yeah.
We want to
Yeah, I'd
hear
love to hear
the
it.
debates that you guys are having. So hit us up on LinkedIn and tell us what you think about it.
Cool.
Cool. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.